All right. Thank you all for taking the time to join me today. As Rachel said, we're going to talk about unlocking the power of inductive inquiry in your literacy classroom. We've got kind of a lot to talk about today and no time to spare, so we're just going to jump right in. So I began my concept-based journey experimenting in my own classroom, just like you are. And during this time, I saw my classroom change and transform, and I've never looked back. This is my 19th year in education. Sometimes I can't believe it because I remember when I was a new teacher, I always thought the teachers that had been teaching for 20 years, it's like, wow, they've been teaching for 20 years. And it's like now that I'm at that point, I just don't feel that old or that I've been teaching that long. And so sometimes it surprises me to think about, this being my 19th year. I spent most of my time teaching middle school language arts and social studies. And then I took a 6-year break to work as an educational consultant and a literacy coach and a consultant teacher with a teaching and learning team at the district office. And last year, I decided to return to the classroom. So right now, I teach high school English full time. I see about 150 high school kids each day. And oh goodness, they keep me on my toes and they keep me laughing. And I just have really enjoyed being back in the classroom. Like it's been refreshing. And it's been filled with lots of new challenges. But the focus of our workshop today is I'm going to share with you some things from my classroom, a lesson that I taught recently, and just kind of walk you through step by step through the process of teaching an inductive lesson. Now, when I'm not at school, in the evenings, on the weekends, in summer vacation, I lead workshops and support educators just like we're doing right now. I'm the co-author of Concept-Based Literacy Lessons, Designing Learning to Ignite Understanding and Transfer. All right, please note that the session is copyright protected. Please don't take screenshots or recordings. The official recording will be available shortly after the session, but you are welcome to take notes for your personal use, and I actually encourage you to take notes for your personal use, and I encourage you to take something you learned today and try it in your own classroom. All right, now I have a question for you, something I'd like you to consider. So thinking back over your years as an educator, what has been one of your favorite or your kind of go-to type of teaching strategy? Something that you love, something that works for you. Go ahead and pop some ideas in the chat box so we can see some ideas from each other. And then in a minute, I'll share with you one of my favorites and how I came to discover it. Let's see, songs. Shared writing, videos. Don't be shy. Chants, yeah, chants are fantastic. Movement, drama, writing workshop. Yeah, all of those. Socratic seminar, that's one of my favorites too. Literacy stations or rotations. Yeah, one-on-one. I do a lot of reading and writing conferences, even with my high school students. It's fantastic. Competitions. Oh, they always love a little competition. Poetry. Yeah, so many amazing things. Now, this is a picture of me. This is a picture. I apologize, it's blurry. This was before digital picture. So I took a picture of the picture to show you. This was me 16 years ago. Okay, so this was my classroom, and I'll tell you, I cringe a little bit when I look at this picture because it's like neon and it's unorganized. And if you compare that with the classroom I show you soon from my current classroom, you'll see the difference. But this was me 16 years ago. I was a year 3 teacher. I had a 1-year-old daughter, and I had just started at a new school. So this was my very first time teaching language arts. My first 2 years were spent teaching 6 sections of 7th grade social studies. So I taught the same lesson 6 times every single day. And by like the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th time teaching it, I couldn't remember what jokes I had told. I was like, did I explain this already? Did I already give these directions? I started to feel like a little bit like I was kind of losing my mind. And it also was really hard to keep that kind of enthusiasm the 5th or 6th time you were teaching it. So when I saw there was a language arts job open at a neighboring school, I decided to change. And so I was teaching language arts for the first time. And I share this with you because this is when I had kind of the biggest discovery I've ever had as an educator. And It came about because I was teaching language arts. I had never taught language arts before. My toolbox was quite small in terms of my instructional strategies. My students were a little bit lower in reading and writing than I had anticipated, lower than my previous school. And I was a little bit surprised, and I wasn't sure exactly how to help them as writers. So I had this idea. I was like, what if I give them lots of examples of writing? I wanted to specifically focus on a literary analysis paragraph. So I posted examples of paragraphs around the room, and then I wrote some questions to go with the paragraphs that would help them notice the things in the paragraph that I wanted them to notice. So it was things like, how well does the textual evidence support the idea in the claim? Very well, not very well, why not? Those sorts of things. And then they traveled around the room with a partner. They used these questions to look at the paragraphs, and they took notes. And then we came back together as a class, and I just said, so what does this help us understand about writing literary analysis paragraphs? What makes a good paragraph and not so good paragraph? What are you going to do in your own writing? And I was just really shocked at the results, the things that they noticed through the use of questions and their ability to take that then and apply it in the paragraphs that they were writing. It just made such a huge impact on their the quality of their paragraphs. And so I was like, ooh, this works. I had no idea what I had done. I just knew it worked. And so I repeated the process over and over with all sorts of different writing styles. I played with different types of questions. I played with different types of ways to take notes or organize. And every single time it worked. And I still didn't know why it worked. And I thought I had invented something new. And I was trying to figure out, like, what do I call this? How do I share it with teachers? Because it was like the most amazing thing I had ever done. And then a few years later, I learned, and this like truly a few years later, I learned it was called inductive inquiry. And as soon as I read inductive, I read what it was, I went, oh, that's like exactly what I had been doing. I just had no idea that's what I was doing. And so once I was able to label it, this is inductive inquiry, then I was able to kind of hold it and own it. And I was able to be more intentional with my ability to replicate it. I knew what I was doing. I knew why I was doing it. And it was just this huge aha moment for me. And what it made me realize is how often do we allow students to uncover why we do what we do as readers, writers, speakers, listeners, without us just telling them. And I realized that the power of inductive inquiry should not be underestimated. And I went through my teacher education program. I was enrolled in a master's program during that time. I was at like year 4 when I started my master's program. No one had told me about inductive learning. I was like blown away, and I said, we need to give more attention to this type of learning. Now, what I want you to think about is what learning looks like inside our students' brains. And I'm thinking about this idea of brain schema. When students learn knowledge and skills, what happens to it? What does it look like? Does it look like new learning stacked, 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 just like random papers piled in a pile in their brains? Or is it organized like a file cabinet by previously learned concepts where they're able to sift, sort, pattern incoming information? I know for my students, most of their learning felt like a giant stack of papers. And we're going to do this assignment, and we're going to do this assignment, and then we're going to do this assignment, and then we're going to do this assignment. And I would imagine it felt kind of random. So if we think about from a student perspective, we have a giant list of standards or curriculum we're to follow. This is just a sample of grade 2 Common Core. So include sensory language to enhance ideas in creative writing. Make predictions prior to and while reading, viewing, or listening to a text. Sequence 4 or more events from a text. Focus and limit the number of ideas in a sentence. I can't even read them all, right, without getting out of breath. And this is just like a sampling. So you think about from a student perspective, how often do we help them really understand why we do what we do? How often do we ask them just to perform these skills without focusing on developing and understanding? So you see that this verb-driven list of activities just goes on and on year after year. We pile more, we pile more, we pile more, right? So what I was thinking about is how do we help develop cohesive, connected literacy learning? Now, we know that practicing skills that are locked into a specific assignment does not necessarily result in learning transfer, especially when the new context is unfamiliar and more complex. We know that. Anyone that's taught language arts knows that because students learned something the previous year and then they come to you like they've never heard it before, right? I experienced that and I'm like, I know for a fact. And I actually even saw it in my own classroom because I taught seventh and eighth grade both. So I would be like, as eighth graders, remember when no, they had no clue. And I was like, I know I taught you that. I could list the activities we did. But for whatever reason, it wasn't taught in a way that they were able to transfer to new and more complex situations. They were able to perform the task, but they didn't really understand why or how we were doing what we were doing. They were just doing my assignments. Now, I'm going to talk about inductive inquiry. This is a visual that's from Rachel French and Carla Marshall's book, Concept-Based Inquiry in Action. If you haven't read that book, I highly recommend it. It's full of so many ideas and strategies for really bringing the concept-based inquiry to life in your classroom. But I share this because I want to contrast deductive versus inductive learning. So we see the deductive approach across the bottom. And I'll say prior to kind of discovering the power of inductive teaching, most of my teaching was deductive. So the teacher would provide the big idea, the generalization, the conceptual understanding, whatever you want to call it. They would provide that up front. Then we'd provide students with some examples. Students would look at the examples and go, oh yeah, I see that. That's true, right? So they might say, I know I did for sure. Writers craft precise images of people, places, and events in a reader's mind through specific words and images. That's what good writers do. Okay, let's look at some examples of it. And then we'd study the examples and the kids would go, oh yeah, I see that. That's true. That's the deductive approach. Now, if we take a look at the top, we flip it. So we start first by providing those factual examples. And we invite students to notice the patterns. What do you see? We have a strategically designed set of guiding questions, which I'll talk about more later. But we invite students to notice the patterns across those factual examples, and students articulate their own understanding, right? So instead of saying, writers craft precise images of people, we might say, how do writers create images in a reader's mind? Let's find out. Let's look at some examples. Let's figure this out, right? And students notice patterns. They express the generalization on their own. Do you see the difference? So a key to remember with inductive teaching is that we're moving student thinking from concrete to abstract, from concrete examples to the abstract concepts and conceptual ideas. And learning transfers at that conceptual level. So I want you to keep that idea in mind. Concrete, abstract, concrete, abstract. We often live in that concrete level, and we don't push student thinking to that abstract level. But I'm going to talk a lot more about that today. So this is a visual that represents what an inductive learning experience might look like in a literacy classroom. I want you to take a look at the bottom of the visual first. So again, we're moving from concrete to abstract. So the first step is for students to examine or investigate concrete examples. This might be a single genre text set. So they're looking at examples of poem 1, poem 2, poem 3, paragraph 1, paragraph 2, paragraph 3. Or it might be a multi-genre text set, right? Where we maybe have a poem, we have an excerpt from a memoir, and we have an example from a song. Using the guiding questions, we help students to see the concepts, to notice the patterns, to see the relationships between the concepts to the point where they're able to express their generalization or their conceptual understanding. That's abstract. So again, we're moving from those concrete examples to the abstract conceptual level. Okay, concrete, abstract. Most curriculum and instruction centered around acquiring knowledge and mastering skills. And that's where the facts and the skills are the end goal. Can you do it? Okay, let's move on. Do you know it? Okay, let's move on. I know I've taught like that plenty of times over my teaching career. But what we think about when we get to that three-dimensional level is that we're using the facts and the skills as the foundation for understanding concepts and generalizations. Okay, so we're using them as tools to develop a deeper, transferable conceptual understanding. And you're going to see from my lesson that I share with you, we're really focused on looking at the craft of writing, but we're focused on students understanding concepts and conceptual ideas. And I'm going to share this lesson in just a moment. First, though, you've heard me say generalization a lot. I've said it probably 10 times already, just in this short time. So let's get a little more specific about what I mean. Generalizations are the relationship between two or more concepts that transfer through time, across cultures, across situations. We often use the idea of an essential understanding or a big idea kind of interchangeably with the term generalization. I like the term generalization personally because that's what students are doing in an inductive model. They are generalizing from the examples. And so to me, that just makes sense. And so you'll hear me use the word generalization. Okay. So it's always important to think about, as a result of my instruction, what is the important conceptual understanding that I want students to understand and be able to transfer independently to new situations? Okay, so if the teacher's not clear on what they want students to understand, the chances are students won't either. So the generalization makes the target for conceptual understanding apparent to the teacher. The generalization makes the target for conceptual understanding apparent to the teacher. So we're clear on where we're going. I'm going to share with you a couple examples of generalizations across grades. So here's a grade 2 example. Background experiences help readers identify and relate to a story. Universal? Is it timeless? Is it abstract? Can you think of examples that you could use to help support this? Right? Again, the generalization is for the teacher. We never tell students what the generalization is. We keep it in our minds and we teach to it so that we're clear about where we want students to go. Okay, so as I share a couple more examples, I just want you to think about how the generalization provides clarity for the teacher. Okay, this is the one I shared earlier. Writers craft precise images of people, places, and events in a reader's mind through specific words and details. Okay, so when we have a generalization like this, it also helps the teacher make decisions about which text to include and what type of work to assign students. So if our goal is that students come to understand this conceptual idea, I would make sure they have examples, they have mentor texts, they have the stories or whatever writing we're focused on that clearly demonstrate word choice creating precise images, right? So it helps the teacher make decisions about what text to read and what type of work to assign. Okay, here's one final example. Discourse enables participants to revise and deepen their current understanding of a topic, idea, or concept. A generalization like this is really fantastic when paired with something like a Socratic seminar. A lot of times we have Socratic seminars and students discuss the content of a text and then they're done. Seminar is over and they move on. Well, I always make sure we reflect on our speaking and listening process as well. What did someone say during the discussion that encouraged you to revise your understanding of the text? Or why is it important to discuss complex ideas or texts? Can you see the difference? Where we stop after students discuss the content of the book or the poem versus pushing them a little further to really understand something deeply about how or why we do what we do as speakers and listeners. So a key idea to remember is that when we reach the level of concepts and generalizations, we move from doing to understanding why we do what we do. Concepts are not an act of doing. Okay, so we're always focused on why or how we do what we do. Now, generalizations serve two primary roles in our lessons. So first, the generalization is set as an instructional target for understanding. And again, that provides teacher clarity. I know where I'm going. I know what I'm teaching to, and I can use that to help me decide what text to assign, what type of work to engage students in. But second, and just as important, is that students are asked to generalize at the end of a lesson. Right? So let's think about this in the context of the visual I shared with you just a couple minutes ago. So again, we're moving from concrete to abstract. We want students to be able to generalize or express what they understand as a result of their experience. They've examined those mentor texts, they've drawn out concept, they've noticed patterns, they've looked at the relationships between concepts, and then they're able to express their understanding. I understand that. Right? Often we skip that step. We just have students do the task. Okay, we're done. And then we move on. We assume they get it without actually asking them. And that was one of the biggest aha moments that I've ever had as an educator is one, how easy it is to invite students to generalize, but two, how often I didn't do it. Like how often I just moved on. We just completed the assignment. Okay, we're done. Here's the next assignment. And students never had that time to consolidate their learning and articulate their learning, articulate their understanding. And it doesn't take that long. It's super easy. And I'm going to share with you in my own lesson kind of how that looked. Okay. Now, from the teacher planning side, we kind of think about the process in reverse. So we looked at it from a student side, reading from the bottom up. Students examine the texts through the carefully curated set of guiding questions to the point where they're able to generalize. From a teacher side, we're flipping it. So first we're thinking about what is our target generalization? What is our target for conceptual understanding? Then we craft a set of guiding questions that serve as a kind of a thinking path for students to reach the generalization. And I'll talk more about that in just a little bit. And then finally, with that, we can think about what are those examples, those texts, the mentor texts that would allow students to uncover these concepts and conceptual ideas, right? What is it that will best set them up to see this idea on their own without me telling them what it is? Okay. So let's look at this in the context of my classroom. So this is a picture from my classroom. I'm going to show you a bunch of pictures from my classroom. I teach full-time high school English, like I shared. I have 3 sections of English 9, 2 sections of American literature, and I have 1 section of creative writing elective class. So this lesson is from my creative writing elective class. And the lesson took about 2 class sessions. Our class periods are 50 minutes long. So if that gives you a little bit of context for how long it took. And our guiding question is, how do writers craft effective personal narrative conclusions? So by this class had a kind of a mix of 9, 10, 11, 12 grade students. This picture here is showing 4 of my seniors. They're actually very proficient writers already. So I had to really think about like, what are some of those kind of nuances in writing that would push them further? Because there's still things we can teach them. Even though they might be 18 years old, there's still things I can teach them to help them grow as writers, particularly in this genre. Okay. So the first thing I did is I created a generalization. And I'll tell you, it was actually quite hard to think of that conceptual idea when I'm thinking about my 18-year-olds, because they, they've had a lot of experience with writing. And so I took the opportunity to bring in some micro concepts. And micro concepts are those concepts that are more precise. They add depth to the discipline. And so I was looking at things like reflection, full circle endings, imagery, symbolism, emotional appeal. And I wanted them to see that when you use those types of strategies, it can help show personal growth and it can help leave a lasting impression on readers. That we really end our narratives strategically and we make very careful word choice in order to impact the reader in different ways. And that was kind of my goal in this lesson. But I knew I couldn't tell students that. I mean, I could stand in front and say, did you know these are 5 great strategies for ending your conclusions or your conclusions for your personal narratives? But in an inductive approach, we don't do that. We think we can't tell them what it is. We can only craft our experiences. We can only use our questioning to help students come to that idea on their own. Now, from there, I created a set of guiding questions. And I think about the guiding questions as that bridge or thinking path between the factual examples and the conceptual idea in the target generalization. For my lesson, I had 2 types of questions. I had factual questions and I had conceptual questions. There are other types of questions, but for this particular lesson, I focused on these two. So the factual questions help build the factual foundational knowledge that students need to construct target generalization. They focus on thinking on a particular point, and the answers provide substantiation for the generalizations. So factual questions are locked in time, place, situation. They don't transfer. Okay? They're locked to the examples, to the author, to me as the reader, or me as the writer. Okay. Now, the conceptual questions move student thinking to a higher level and help bridge a specific example to a conceptual idea. These questions ask about conceptual relationships, which force linking, and they require a more sophisticated level of cognitive processing and thinking. Conceptual questions are transferable across multiple examples and situations. Now, when I was first getting started with a concept-based approach, I had a really hard time writing guiding questions. And I hear that from a lot of teachers I work with. They say guiding questions are the hardest part because you really have to think from a student perspective. What is going to help nudge their thinking until they can realize that generalization on their own? We have to be so strategic. So what helped me as I think about like literally covering my mouth, I can't tell them. I can't tell them the idea I want them to understand. I can only use my questions, and I can only use the examples and the learning situation I've set up. That's my challenge. How do I do it? Right? And then I think like, what's the first thing they would need to look at? What's the next thing they would need to look at? What's the next thing they would look at? What's that final question I could ask where they can't help but generalize? You know what I mean? Like I really had to get kind of in their perspective and think like, I'm looking at these examples. So in the lesson I taught, we were looking at personal narratives, which they've written, I don't know how many times by the time they're seniors, right? They've written personal narratives probably in third grade and fifth grade and eighth grade and ninth grade. Like it's something they do a lot. So I had to think like, what do I need them to understand? How am I going to get them to understand that without me telling them? Okay. So I visual like cover my mouth. I can't tell them. Okay. Now, why don't we tell them? Why wouldn't we just tell students the generalization? Right? I mean, when you think about it, if we tell them, they're accepting what we say at face value. They're not really taking on any of the ownership of learning or that meaning making process. We're taking away, we're withholding that opportunity for them to make meaning when we just tell them, right? So it's important that we think about how do we put them in the driver's seat? How do we put students in charge of their understanding? Yeah, I see. We want the cognitive load to be on their side. Exactly. That's something that I'll talk about more in a little bit, but I always think like, who's doing the thinking in the lesson? Am I doing all the cognitive work or are they? And we want our students to be taking on the appropriate amount of cognitive load at various points in the lesson. And that inductive learning design is really kind of a powerful way to put students in charge of the thinking and the meaning making. Okay. So for my lesson, I had 5 questions. 4 of them are factual. That's something that I see teachers that are new to concept-based often don't realize. They feel like the conceptual questions are the most important. But I almost argue the opposite, that you have to have a rock solid set of factual questions or students won't see the concepts and the conceptual relationships in the examples. We picked the examples for a reason. I know I wanted students to look at these texts for a reason or these examples for a reason. And our factual questions helps tune students into those nuances of the concepts. So I had questions like, what techniques does the writer use to craft a personal narrative conclusion? What does the personal narrative conclusion reveal to the reader? How does the writer reveal this to the reader? How does the personal narrative conclusion shape the reader's overall experience with the story and its meaning? So notice that these questions are factual. They don't transfer. They're locked in time, place, situation. They are locked to the specific examples that students are investigating, right? And I have 4 of them. I have 1 conceptual question, and that conceptual question is meant to bridge from those factual examples to the conceptual idea in my generalization. How do writers craft effective personal narrative conclusions? when students answer that, they can't help but generalize from their experiences. So we're using those questions as a thinking path that nudge student thinking, nudge student thinking, nudge student thinking until they realize that generalization on their own. Okay. Notice that the conceptual question is not locked to those specific examples. It's transferable, right? And that is key. So one takeaway that I'd like you to kind of lock in your brain right now is that factual questions are so important for the success of an inductive inquiry experience. It's not the opposite. Sometimes I see teachers will have like one factual question and then 4 conceptual questions. And I'm like, oh goodness, how are students going to focus and see the concepts and the examples if their brain's going all over the place with all these conceptual questions? So we really lock in and try to create a solid set of factual questions that will focus and direct student thinking. Okay. So now from there, I've got my generalization. I have my questions. Now I have to pick my text, pick my examples. It's really important that you pick the right examples. I see when students in my classroom are not generalizing the way I think they should, it's usually a result of my questions not being quite focused enough or pointing them in the right direction, or it's the examples I picked. Either there's not enough of them or they're not quite clear enough. So when I'm picking my mentor text or my examples for students to look at, I'm very mindful and I think, like, could they see this conceptual idea from this example? Would this illustrate this to them? Is it a solid representation of the conceptual idea in my generalization? If it is not super clear, or sometimes I pick them that are fuzzy for a reason because I want to have like a range of quality. I'll pick one that's not so good or 2 that are not so good. So that's something that I actually did for this lesson is I wanted a range of quality because I was having students sort them on a continuum, which I'll show you in a moment. So you just have to be strategic with the examples and ensure that students are having the opportunity to uncover this idea through what they're looking at. So for my lesson, I had 2 sets of mentor texts. One was just this little strips of paper that had excerpts from the concluding statements of some personal narrative examples. And there were a lot of them, like maybe 12 or 15 of them. And I made sure that I had a couple examples of all of the important concepts I was looking at, such as full circle endings. And then the other collection I had was full personal narrative texts. So we use these 2 as my kind of text sets for the lesson. So a key point to remember is that inquiry learning in a literacy classroom allows students to be actively engaged in the construction of meaning through the exploration of rich text examples across a range of genres. So again, I've said this a couple times. Our goal is that students uncover why or how we do what we do as readers, writers, speakers, listening. That they're not just taking what we see at face value, but they're investigating, they're making meaning for themselves, and they're owning it. They get it. So my lesson had kind of 3 basic steps. So the first step was to make sure students were clear on the individual concepts. So we had our generalization articulated. I have my guiding questions planned out. I have my text planned out. I had to think about now, what are those actual engagements students are going to participate in class that help them come to that generalization. So the first thing I did is I was thinking about, we need to talk about the individual concepts. So I've said concept a lot, but I want to do a quick review of like what is a concept just to make sure we're on the same page here. So I think about a concept like a mental model. So if I say ecosystem, my guess is you have a solid mental model. Something pops in your head. You probably could give me some examples quite easily. You could talk about the attributes of an ecosystem. If I gave you a handful of things, you could say that's an ecosystem and that's not an ecosystem and explain why. You have a mental model. Now think about the concept of argument. Do you have a clear mental model? When I say argument or argument writing or opinion writing, you have something that pops in your head. You could identify the attributes of what makes something an argument. You could sort a collection of texts into examples and non-examples, right? It's probably pretty clear. Right? If you teach language arts or language, that's probably pretty clear. Now, what if I say logical fallacy? How's your mental model? Is it getting a little fuzzy? For most of us, unless you're teaching a secondary language class or a social studies class, that one might be a little fuzzy. You might not be able to identify common attributes. You might not be able to sort it into examples and non-examples. Okay, what if I got a little bit more specific and I said straw man argument? How's your mental model there? Do you have a mental model for the straw man argument, or is it just like a blank space? I'll tell you, it was a blank space for me up until maybe 5 years ago when I started really focused on argumentative writing with my students. I was learning about different techniques and how to kind of identify and how to use different techniques. And I was able to identify the common attributes and build my mental model. So think about a concept as like a mental model. Okay. Now, to truly understand a concept, you need multiple representations of it. And if you're, a little fuzzy on the straw man argument, you probably haven't actually taken the time to form that concept. You haven't looked at examples. You haven't identified the attributes, right? And it probably hasn't been relevant to your teaching context or your schooling. And that's okay. So a concept, sometimes teachers are like, is this a concept? Is it not a concept? So there's a little test you can run it through. So you can think, is it timeless? Is it universal? Is it abstract to different degrees? Is it represented by one or two words? And do examples share common attributes? You're going to hear me say that a lot. Examples share common attributes. So we think about the concept of character. Oh, I just told you it was a concept. I was going to ask you, is character a concept? But I spoiled it for you. Yes, character is a concept. Okay. It's timeless, it's universal, it's abstract, it's represented by one or two words. Now, how about this one? Harry Potter. Is Harry Potter a concept? No. There's just one Harry Potter. It's a proper noun. It is not a concept. Okay. So, that's a pretty clear example of concept versus not a concept. Our world is organized by concepts. So before we talk more about language arts, I just want to share a few concepts in different disciplines. So social studies, we've got community, want, need, role, responsibility. Science, external structure, function, physical feature, habitat, right? Like our world, everything we do is is organized by concepts. Setting, plot, dialogue, illustration. So for my class, I made sure that the examples in the sort that students engaged in represented the concepts for my generalization. And again, I told you I went quite micro with my concepts, quite specific, because if I didn't, it wouldn't be the appropriate level of specificity for my age of learner. And that's really important. Like you always have to think, is this a new idea, new learning for my students? So I looked at reflection, full circle ending, imagery, symbolism, and emotional appeal. So the examples on the students' table here all show that in action. Okay, so I had students sort and categorize those examples. So what techniques does the writer use to craft a meaningful personal narrative conclusion? They discussed the examples, they sorted it, and they created a label for each group. Now, at this point in time, I didn't tell students what to look for. I just let them kind of read and talk and explore the examples, and they kind of debated back and forth. They started to notice patterns and commonalities. I wasn't worried about the perfect label quite yet at this point. I wanted them just to talk and engage with the examples. So a key point to remember is that our brains are patterning machines, and this activity is all about helping students identify patterns and help students move from those concrete examples to the abstract concepts that they represent. Okay. So students created labels, and these are some of the labels they created from that sort. And what you'll see is they added some things that I didn't intend necessarily, but that's okay. We want students to be thinking conceptual, to be drawing from their background. They might not have the correct term yet. They might not have the correct label yet. So for example, you can see one of them says contrast. I didn't know what the student meant by that. And so I had to ask them. And then once I was able to hear their thinking, I was able to help them with a different label that might represent that more articulately. And you could see that process happened here, where then we went and we kind of shared the labels and we worked together to create an anchor chart. And this is the part where I was able to clarify the vocabulary, and sort out any misconceptions. And what I have found that even though I teach high school, they still love the smelling markers and the poster paper. Like when I ask who wants to write, they all want to write on the easel still. And part of it is because I use Mr. Sketch smelling markers, and they like to smell the markers. But that's okay. If that's what gets them up there to write on the board, I can handle them smelling the markers each time they come up. But you can see there, they're sharing their labels, and I have a student recording. I'm standing off to the side, helping them kind of, like I said, clarify the vocabulary and make sure that we've sifted out any misconceptions. Now, from there, we went and we looked at our next set of mentor texts. And at this point, students did 3 different activities with it. So the first activity is I just had them read all of the examples. And you can see there's like 6 or 7 examples. I tried to pick ones that weren't quite as long, just being mindful of the time. They're all basically on the front of one page in like a size 9 or 10 font. So I wanted to make sure it was doable within the given time frame that I had. And they just sorted them from favorite to least favorite and talked about why. And I wasn't really looking for much more than that, besides getting them familiar with the texts and starting to build that personal experience, or that connection with the text, because that's part of our generalization, is leaving a lasting impression on the reader. So I just wanted them to start kind of experiencing, thinking about the concepts, and engaging in dialogue. And now what's interesting is these are my freshmen, 2 freshmen, and then my seniors were at the table right behind them. And what I love about this type of learning is that even though they're 9th grade and 12th grade, the lesson was perfectly appropriate for both of them, both groups, because I was able to engage in conversation with them as they were working. And I didn't need to plan 2 separate lessons for my 9th grade and my 12th grade. They just happened to partner up with each other because they're kind of scared of the 12th graders. And I had to like get them used to being with the seniors. So at this point, they were still a little bit shy to be with the seniors. And so I just let them, because I was taking pictures and they were already a little uncomfortable with me taking pictures. And so I was like, that's fine. You don't have to mix on this one. But you can see they're reading, they're discussing, they're sorting. Okay. So now a key point to remember is that to truly understand a concept, we have to let students talk about what they're understanding and what they're thinking about it as a result of their learning. So naming and justifying allows students to practice explaining what is understood. I'm putting it here because I like this because. Yep. Then I changed the labels. So I said, now instead of favorite to least favorite, it's most effective, least effective. And I had them think about the different attributes that made the example effective versus not so effective. And again, this is all about just getting them familiar with the text and kind of debating nuances in it. And what's interesting is when they're trying to put the ones kind of in the middle, usually there's an example that's like clearly the least effective and one that's clearly the most effective. It's that kind of middle part of the spectrum where students really have to negotiate and be able to explain what they're thinking to be able to place it in that spot. Okay. Now, from that point, we moved into the step where I'm wanting students to get a little bit more specific and work towards that generalizing process. So we went back to that same set of mentor texts. This time they had a cross comparison chart. And I just had our factual questions across the top. And students worked together to look at the questions. And those questions were drawing attention to the different components of the mentor text that I needed them to look at. And I use a cross comparison chart like this because it helps them organize in a way that really highlights the patterns. They can see the similarities, they can see the differences, they can see those commonalities, and it helps direct and focus thinking. And again, we're all about empowering students to take on the thinking and the meaning-making process. So we need students to uncover the generalization, but it's not an accidental process. It's not like they just all of a sudden figure out how to uncover the generalization on their own. It's a very strategic and kind of focused process that the teacher's leading them through. It's not a free-for-all. And sometimes that's a misconception I see with teachers is they're like, well, my students aren't generalizing. And well, what have you done to scaffold the process or to support their thinking? So you'll see I've been very intentional, kind of step by step, with helping students come to the point where they're understanding this idea. Okay. So from there, we're looking at what does that personal narrative conclusion reveal to the reader. We added a second layer to our or to our anchor chart. So you can see the bottom part was from the first step. Now we're writing in pink marker on that top part. And we're looking at things like reveals growth and change, or the narrator learns something. It teaches life lessons. We see how the person changed. So we're looking at when you use these types of techniques, it causes this, right? That's what I'm trying to highlight. And then we get to a point where I invite students to generalize. It's a super easy process. I gave them big sticky notes, told them to respond to our guiding conceptual question. I understand that. Students shared their ideas at a table group, then we shared as a class. And every generalization sounded a little bit different in students' own words, but I was able to compare it to what I was kind of my target that I had identified to ensure that their thinking was in line with it. So the ultimate goal is that students can use language to articulate what they're thinking and understanding as a result of their learning experiences. Language is central to learning. It makes it possible to cognitively reconstruct the experience, and in doing so, clarify, share, internalize, and ultimately transfer their learning. So as I said before, I learned the hard way by often having my learning just stop when they're done with the activity versus pushing them one step further to explain what they're understanding. Why are we doing this? How are we doing this? What do you now understand as a result of this learning? Okay. And then the final step is for students to transfer what they uncovered into their own writing. So we had students working on their personal narratives during this time, and we took a little pause to investigate writing conclusions. And then they went back into their drafts. They revised their conclusions. They shared their before and after version with their writing critique group, gave each other feedback. During that time, I also circulated and kind of did some writing conferences and supported if students needed specific skill areas. Like I had one student who actually was a senior. He just got a really hard time with comma usage, and the commas were randomly everywhere. And so although he was working on his conclusion, I used that time to like help him narrow in like where should we place a comma and support him in kind of that coaching role as well. And it's funny at the he had told me at one point that that was like the most amazing thing he had ever learned was the strategies for placing commas, because he said no one had actually ever told me that before. I don't believe him. I think teachers have probably told him, but for whatever reason, the way I said it, it connected at that moment in time. But yeah, so writing conferences, as I shared before, and someone had identified that as your favorite strategy. They're really great. Okay. Now, the key to remember is that there's no shortcut to understanding. So we can't just infuse students' brains with this deep conceptual understanding. They have to take on the meaning-making process. And that goes back to that question of who's doing the thinking in the lesson. Is it me or is it my students? And if I'm the one doing all the thinking, how might I be able to restructure the task to allow students to take on more of that opportunity? Okay, so to review, in my lesson, students investigated concrete examples using guiding questions that served as a thinking path. And this thinking path helped nudge student thinking until they uncovered the abstract idea in the target generalization on their own. So this conceptual idea is all about being thinking about being a writer and then transferring it to their own writing process as they revise their personal narrative drafts. So does this seem doable? Kind of a concrete, easy way. It's super doable. And again, if you just kind of think in your mind, concrete to abstract, and we're nudging student thinking along the way until they come to that point where they're generalizing. I'm going to share a few things with you. We're getting a little bit low on time, but I just have a couple more things that I think could be helpful in this process of creating inductive lessons. But I am conscious of our time, so I'm kind of watching and seeing how we're doing here. Okay. So some things to remember. I've got kind of 3 tips for you to remember. So one would be use multiple representations. Okay, use multiple representations. There's so many reasons why, and I'm going to talk a little more about that. Number two is think about how you can highlight patterns. And number three is invite students to express their thinking and their understanding. Now, I'm a huge fan of universal design for learning. I actually went to the Trainers Institute in Boston several years back, and universal design for learning was created by CAST. It's a framework that aims at creating learning environments that can accommodate the diverse learning needs of all students regardless of ability, and we do that by providing multiple means of engagement, representation, action, and expression. And I think concept based and UDL are beautiful together, and that would be like a wish I had that I could put on the world, is that we look at how to bring these two models together in a way that can really kind of open up the equitable access in our classrooms. So this is pulled from CAST, and CAST says that all learners need to be able to generalize and transfer their learning to new contexts. Students may vary in the amount of scaffolding they need for memory and transfer in order to improve their ability to access their prior learning. Of course, all learners can benefit from assistance in how to transfer the information they have to other situations, as learning is not about individual facts in isolation, and students need multiple representations for this to occur. Without the support and use of multiple representations, information might be learned but is inaccessible in new situations. When I read that for the first time, I was just like, yes, like we often give students information, they learn it in bits and pieces, but then it's not accessible in new situations. It makes me think back to that giant stack of papers in their brains. So I want us to look about this as an example. So subordinating conjunction. This is a micro concept that I focused on in my classroom this year. I noticed that my juniors were consistently not putting commas in the correct place, especially when they were writing sentences that used a subordinating conjunction. They didn't have a mental model for this. Okay, so here's a definition. It's a conjunction that introduces a subordinate clause. Okay, how does this support you in developing your mental model? Does it help clarify? When I say subordinating conjunction, do you have a clear mental model now that I've given you the definition? Probably not, right? And so it probably helps you about as much as it helped them. So unless you already know what this is, this single representation doesn't quite cut it, right? Now, what if I do a definition plus some decontextualized examples? Although, because, and after. That helps a little bit, right? You're like, oh yeah, I've written with those. I know how to use those. Okay, what if I give you the definition, several decontextualized examples, and a contextualized example? After I ate dinner, comma, I took my dog for a walk around the block. So you see how your mental model is growing stronger, right, with each new representation? Okay, what if I give you multiple representations of contextualized examples? As I entered the room, I hope to see dinner on the table. Although I like ice cream, my first choice will always be chocolate. See, it's getting better, isn't it? Right? So we have a definition, we have contextualized examples, now we have and decontextualized and contextualized. I knew that wasn't still, enough for my students. So we played with whiteboards. So students identified a noun, wrote it on a slip of paper, placed the noun in a basket. I drew the noun. That was the subject of the sentence. Then I provided a subordinating conjunction, and they practiced writing sentences. And they were able to look around, see the comma placement. Like I was really emphasizing, where does the comma go in this sentence? In that 35 minutes, we had like 200 examples. It was really amazing. And so when you're thinking about how do you create multiple representations for students, it can look a lot of different ways. There's lots of different kind of approaches to multiple representations. This is one of my favorite ways for multiple representations. This was for my classroom years ago. We were studying the notice and note signposts. And, the way I had been teaching it before, I wasn't quite satisfied with. So I thought, well, what if we create this mural? And every time, we see one, we add to kind of this was a map of the setting of the story. So we added these signposts, and you can see the different signposts correspond with different colors. And we were able to create this interactive mural with multiple representations of the signposts. Totally different way of thinking about multiple representations, but it was so powerful. Here's another example. If you teach primary or preschool, I love loose parts. It's a fantastic way for multiple representation. So here we have a story. Students are learning about setting. What is setting and how is story settings represented? And this student built a gigantic setting to Uno's garden out of loose parts, right? I love loose parts. Now, multiple representations can take a lot of time, especially at first. And I've really grown kind of fond of ChatGPT in helping me get started. So I often will pull some examples from ChatGPT. Like I'll say, I'm a high school English teacher. I need 5 examples of blank, full circle endings, and a personal narrative conclusion. Range in topics that would relate with a teenager. Like you can get very specific in your prompt. Then I can take that and revise those versus writing them from scratch. So that's been really helpful for me as I've gone back into the classroom because I've never taught American literature before. It was a new subject for me, and so I didn't have examples. I've been making everything from scratch, and so ChatGPT has been a really helpful tool for me in that area just to get me started. So I'm not writing everything from scratch. Okay. Now, the other thing I want you to think about is kind of ways that you can organize student thinking. So you remember the second thing on our list was highlighting patterns. I've shared with you a couple different ways that I've highlighted patterns already, but this is a super simple one, just using, I have like a bunch of giant Post-it notes. And so I had students examine some examples, multiple examples of satire. It was a new concept for my 9th graders, and they really had no experience with it before. And I had them work with a partner to create a list of the attributes of the texts they were examining. And then we just went around the room and took turns sharing the attributes that the group saw and writing them on a poster paper. And every time we saw someone said it, we put a check by it. Right. And that helped to highlight patterns. And then students were able to use that to create their own definition. So again, we're thinking about multiple representations. We're thinking about opportunities for patterns. And then the final thing is inviting students to express their understanding during and at the end of an exercise. So here we have a group of my juniors. They're sorting examples. We were talking about rhetoric and rhetorical choices, specifically tone. And so what I did is I made 3 different scenarios, and each scenario had like 10 different responses that a teenager might give in that situation. So one situation was you got fired from your job and your boss didn't tell you and you showed up for work. The second scenario was you got a really bad grade on your essay and you don't think it's fair. The third scenario is your parents said, no, you cannot attend the event you want to attend. And then I had, for each one of those scenarios, there was a set of responses, and they sorted them from most effective to least effective rhetorical choices. So things like, you say no to everything. You never let me do anything. That would be on a slip. And then another example would be like, I understand your decision, but could you please reconsider? I promise I'll be responsible. And so a range of different types of responses, and students engaged in kind of a conversations related to the tone and the rhetorical choices. This example is blank because blank. So they had to talk and justify their placement. So I wasn't waiting until the end of the exercise to have them generalize. I was having them start to practice articulating and sharing their thinking. Okay. Same thing here. They were looking at direct and indirect characterizations. These are some of my freshmen. And I know this is blank because blank. So they were finding examples from the sort I gave them, but also from their own independent reading novels. And in order to write it on their chart, they had to say it out loud, right? So again, I'm requiring that thinking verbally, where they're talking about what they're thinking and getting them kind of to practice doing that, which is not always easy, right? Especially if they haven't had that sort of learning in their past, right? They might be kind of quiet. Like I have one class that's so quiet. I have well, I have to force them to talk. And these sorts of activities force them to talk because they would sit there in silence the whole period if I let them. And I don't let them do that. Okay, so to review one final time, inductive inquiry is all about moving student thinking from concrete examples to abstract concepts and conceptual ideas. So our generalization is our target for instruction so that we're clear on where we want to go, where we want student thinking to go. We also invite students to generalize at the end of a lesson. We use our guiding questions as a thinking path, kind of nudge student thinking, nudge student thinking, nudge student thinking until they're to the point where they can articulate their generalization. We can use graphic organizers and other tools to help highlight patterns and to help keep student thinking organized. And throughout the process and at the end of the process, we want students talking about their thinking, talking about their understanding to the point where they'll express their generalization. So as you plan your next lesson, I just want you to think about, who's doing the thinking in your lesson? And again, are you taking on most of the cognitive load? And if you are, how can you put some of that back on your students? And I encourage you to try something small, like a little sort, or, something that seems manageable as a starting place. Because inductive inquiry doesn't have to be big and elaborate and scary. It can happen in those small moments where students, again, are moving from concrete to abstract. So I'd like you to pop in the chat box, what's something that you've learned today that you kind of want to try, or you're thinking about, furthering your consideration of it, or something that you might want to think about for your own classroom. You can go ahead and add some ideas in the chat box. I think it'd be good to hear each other's ideas at this moment. Yeah, guiding questions as a thinking path.
Okay.
Yeah, there's so many different ways we use questions, and using our guiding questions as a thinking path is one method when we're constructing inductive learning design. Yeah, highlighting patterns. Yeah, getting students to reflect. I understand that. It's so fast and simple. Yep, concrete examples, factual questions leading to the conceptual question. Yeah, these are all so great. Yeah, the factual versus conceptual question was one of the biggest ahas that I have ever had as an educator. I mean, I will say pretty much everything related to inductive inquiry, but like when I shared with you how I uncovered inductive inquiry personally, I had no idea about factual versus conceptual questions. I did it by accident. And then once I realized that was like a thing and there were labels for it was just game changing for me, because then I could be really intentional with those kind of rock solid set of factual questions and the conceptual question that linked everything and created that bridge. Yeah, so many great ideas. Thank you so much for sharing. Now, if you're interested in learning more, I'll be hosting an online workshop, Foundations of Concept-Based Literacy and Language, that starts on March 10th. It's one of my favorite courses of the year because, everyone that's on the call is interested in language and literacy. And so it's so fun when we get together. We have Zoom, so we have video calls throughout the week, or not video calls, sorry, videos that you're watching independently throughout the week. And then on the weekend, we have Zoom calls offered at 2 different times where we get together and we get to share ideas, give feedback, answer questions, learn some new strategies. It's just a lot of fun and I really enjoy it. So if you're interested, I hope that you will join me.
I've just put the link to that in the chat, Tiffany.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Well, do we have, I know, Rachel, I see we're kind of out our time. Was there any questions we want to take before we say goodbye, or are we ready to sign off?
I do have a couple of questions that I've been recording from the chat as you have been going through. So one of the questions that was a little bit earlier, Eduardo asked, do you explicitly teach how to write a good generalization?
Yes. So I'm going to think about it in 2 ways. So one, we teach teachers how to write a good generalization. And the reason why we teach teachers how to write a good generalization is just for that clarity. If a generalization is not well written, It could lead to kind of the wrong series of learning engagements, or it could lack the specificity needed to be a clear target for instruction. Now, in terms of my students, I don't explicitly teach them how to write a good generalization, but I use my questions and my feedback to help clarify. So, for example, if they say like full circle endings impact a reader's experience, I would say, well, tell me more. How does it? Be specific. I need some concrete words, but I don't like tell them that generalization is wrong. That is not a good quality generalization, but I nudge them with my questions and help them articulate. And then I might be like, see, isn't that better? Isn't that more clear? I prefer this one over this one because, that kind of thing. So it's more of like that coaching mode in the moment versus like explicitly saying, when we write generalizations, we must do these three things, because I really want it to be an extension of their thinking, and I want it to feel natural, not like a thing we have to do, right? So that's why that's my personal approach, is more from that kind of on the spot coaching to help them clarify and see the difference from one that's well written from one that's not. Yeah. Rachel, what else?
That was a great response to that question. Thanks. Gideon asked, could factual questions also be conceptual? And I've seen this one come up a little bit before, where people will be labeling their questions in the planner and they'll be labeling F and C. And I think it's because the factual questions do have concepts in them. And that can be confusing. Do you want to speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah. So I had two things that popped in my head when you said that. So one was exactly what you were expressing is, so if a factual question contains a concept, which most of them do in some capacity, because I don't know how you would really write a question without a concept, you could make it seem like, well, we're talking about concepts in the examples. But what you have to remember is that a factual question is locked in time, place, or situation. So we're looking at, how does this author do this? How does this text? How do you as the reader? It's not transferable. So to be a conceptual question, we have to be able to step back and say, how do writers? And it has to be that broad, transferable, not locked to that specific instance. The other thing, Rachel, that made me think of is the type of question that we call concept formation, which we didn't talk about in this session, but we would talk further in our course about it. But it's those questions that are asking about one concept in isolation. So we might say like, what is symbolism? And we're really looking at how to help students come to a deep understanding of that single concept, to develop that mental model of the single concept. So it's conceptual, but we treat it a little bit differently than a conceptual question, because conceptual questions always have multiple concepts in a conceptual relationship. And this just has one. So we call them concept formation questions.
Great. Thanks, Tiffany. Yeah, this last one is more of a kind of wondering than a specific question. But Shaquille said, I'd like to understand how less powerful central ideas impact learning in comparison to more powerful. And the thing that really stood out for me in your presentation today, I love that you're showing what a 12th grade understanding looks like, because all too often when I'm coaching with teachers, they write generalizations that potentially are a strong generalization, but they're completely wrong for the grade level that you're teaching. And when I'll ask the teachers, do they already understand that? The teachers will go, well, yeah. And so we're not teaching them something that's new. And so today you were showing that we actually need to really make sure that we're scaling up with those micro concepts, increasing the complexity and specificity. Anything else that come to mind when you think about the impact of less powerful generalizations, or when teachers are? Yeah.
So what you said was what came into my mind first. And then the second thing that came to mind was just the idea of teacher clarity. When a generalization is vague or too broad, we can't really think about how we would actually teach it. Like, how would you teach that? And the more clear your generalization is, the clearer target it becomes for instruction. And so, like, if you're thinking about the ones that I shared, I bet things popped in your head where, like, I could teach it this way. I could use these examples. Like, you knew how to approach it. And what I see with kind of these giant, big ideas is the teacher doesn't really know how to teach it. And the text selection isn't really clear. And you're kind of like, huh, like, what do I do now? And I feel like when you have the more clear generalizations, it comes naturally like, oh yeah, I know what to do, because you're experts at the grade levels you teach or the subjects you teach. You have that kind of internal instinct, and the clarity and generalization is key to helping you know what's the next step. Like, what are your activities going to look like? What text you're going to use? Yeah, thank you.
One last thing I'd like to do, and Tiffanee, you had no idea that I was going to do this, but if you stop sharing for a moment, I'm actually going to share one of your unit planners. Here we go. So this is a unit planner that Tiffanee has developed previously for a grade 8 unit on dystopian literature. And the reason I want to show this planner is just because so often teachers actually write some good generalizations, and Tiffanee talked about guiding questions equal the pathway to thinking, and that is the student experience of those guiding questions. But for teachers, the guiding questions equal your learning engagements. If you don't ask the guiding questions, then they're not going to get to that. That's the pathway for their thinking. So it seems obvious, but when we come down to those learning engagements, you actually have to be asking and answering each of the questions. And you can see here in this planner that Tiffanee's developed, she goes through each of the questions at the factual level, and then she's actually asking, generalize, using this conceptual question. How does an author make sense of a science speculative fiction story? How does an author make a science speculative fiction story believable? And that's the answer that they're coming to. So planning out your learning engagements according to your guiding questions actually really makes it time, if you're collaboratively planning with a group of teachers, making the time to get your questions right. Each teacher can plan different learning engagements, but ask the same set of questions to guarantee that learning. One teacher might use completely different texts, or you read a different novel, but asking and answering those guiding questions and building towards those shared understandings. All right, that's it for today's session. Thank you so much, Tiffanee. It's wonderful to get a little opportunity to have a glimpse inside your classroom and see some of the amazing things that are happening for the very lucky students that you are working with. And thank you to everyone.
I'm going to tell them you said that. I think sometimes they don't appreciate it. Like, Rachel French said, you're very lucky.
Indeed. And thank you to all of you who have shown up during the weekend to come along and share your own experiences and learn with us together today. We'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.